This is Psychological Exit Ramps, Episode 4, where people quietly reclaim their thinking. There's a moment that sometimes happens inside groups that feels almost invisible at first. You're in a room, or part of a meeting, or scrolling through a discussion where many people seem to share the same opinion. And at first, everything feels normal. People are nodding, people are agreeing. The conversation moves quickly because no one seems to challenge the direction it's taking. And in many ways, that feels comfortable. Harmony inside a group is pleasant. Agreement feels efficient. No tension, no conflict, but occasionally someone notices something unusual. The conversation feels just a little too smooth. Important questions never seem to appear. Certain possibilities are never raised, and the more you observe the discussion, the more it begins to feel like everyone is participating in the same conclusion without ever actually examining it. No one is forcing the agreement, no one is demanding compliance, yet somehow the outcome seems predetermined. This is one of the strange dynamics of human groups, because the pressure to agree rarely appears as pressure, it appears as belonging. And belonging is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. Human beings are deeply social creatures. For most of human history, survival depended on staying connected to a group. Belonging meant protection. Belonging meant resources. Belonging meant survival. And because of this history, the human brain developed powerful mechanisms for maintaining social harmony. We read facial expressions. We notice tone. We sense when a conversation becomes uncomfortable. And often we adjust our behavior automatically to restore balance. Most of these mechanisms are helpful. They allow people to cooperate, to build trust, to function together smoothly. But in group environments, those same mechanisms can quietly produce something else. Conformity. And conformity doesn't always arrive through direct pressure. Often, it happens through subtle signals. The first few people in a discussion express confidence about a particular idea. Others notice the confidence. They also notice the reactions around the room: approval, agreement, no resistance. So when their turn comes to speak, they may soften any doubts they had, or they may phrase their thoughts in a way that aligns more closely with the emerging consensus. Then another person does the same, and another. Soon the conversation develops momentum, not because everyone independently reached the same conclusion, but because everyone is responding to the signals being produced by the group. Psychologists sometimes refer to this process as informational social influence. When people feel uncertain about a situation, they often look to others for cues about what is correct. And if enough people appear confident about a particular direction, that confidence can begin to shape how everyone else interprets the situation. Over time, the group becomes more aligned, but something important is lost in the process. The range of perspectives begins to shrink. Questions disappear, doubts remain unspoken, and the group slowly begins to function as if the consensus itself is evidence of correctness. But consensus and accuracy are not the same thing. A room full of intelligent people can still move together in the wrong direction if the signals guiding their behavior encourage agreement more than investigation. This is the trap of groupthink. It doesn't require manipulation. It doesn't require control. It only requires one simple condition: a group where the cost of disagreement feels slightly higher than the reward of curiosity. Once that balance shifts, agreement begins reproducing itself. And the group can move forward with remarkable confidence even when important questions were never asked. But every once in a while, someone notices the pattern. And when they do, something interesting begins to change. The realization often begins in a quiet moment. You're in a conversation where many people seem to agree. The discussion moves quickly. Ideas are accepted almost immediately. Everyone appears confident about the direction the group is taking, and at first that can feel reassuring. Agreement creates a place of stability. It feels like progress. But then something small happens. Someone raises a question, not a hostile question, just a thoughtful one. And suddenly, the atmosphere in the room changes, not dramatically, but noticeably. People become slightly uncomfortable. The question doesn't get explored. Instead, it gets redirected. Someone reframes it. Someone dismisses it. Someone quickly introduces a different point that brings the conversation back to the original direction. And within a few moments, the discussion continues as if the question had never appeared. If you're paying attention, that moment can be very revealing because it shows something important about how the group is functioning. The group isn't simply exploring ideas. The group is actually protecting a direction. And once you see this happen once, you begin noticing other small signals. People carefully watching each other's reactions before speaking. Certain individuals speaking more confidently than others. Subtle shifts in tone when someone introduces an idea that doesn't match the emerging consensus. You notice that disagreement isn't exactly forbidden, but it feels inconvenient, uncomfortable, slightly disruptive to the flow of the group. And that's when the deeper realization begins forming. Many people inside the room may not actually be certain about the conclusion being reached, but they're certain about something else. They're certain about the social signals being produced by the group. Who appears confident? Which opinions receive approval? Which ideas move smoothly through the discussion? Over time, those signals begin guiding behavior more than the ideas themselves. People start aligning their contributions with what seems socially acceptable, not necessarily because they fully agree, but because maintaining harmony inside the group feels safer than introducing uncertainty. And once that dynamic takes hold, something subtle happens to the thinking process. The group stops functioning as a collection of independent observers. Instead, it begins functioning like a single organism trying to maintain internal stability. Agreement becomes the priority, clarity becomes secondary. And the strange thing about groupthink is that many of the people participating in it are intelligent, thoughtful individuals. They may even privately notice some of the same doubts. But when everyone sees the same social signals, those doubts often remain unspoken until one day someone recognizes what is happening. They realize the agreement in the room may not be evidence of independent thinking at all. It may be simply the natural result of people responding to the same social pressures. And once that possibility becomes visible, something important changes. The consensus stops looking like certainty. It begins looking like a pattern that can be observed. And once a pattern can be observed, it can no longer operate completely unnoticed. That recognition marks the beginning of another exit ramp. Once someone recognizes the pattern of groupthink, the first instinct is often to push against it, to challenge the consensus, to prove the group is missing something important. But confronting groupthink directly often produces the opposite of the intended result. Groups tend to defend their internal stability. When disagreement appears too abruptly, people may interpret it as disruption rather than curiosity. The group instinctively tries to restore harmony, which means the dissenter can quickly become the focus of attention rather than the question itself. The real exit ramp begins with something quieter. Instead of trying to defeat the group dynamic, the observer begins separating social signals from actual reasoning. They start paying attention to how ideas are evaluated. Are ideas being explored because they make sense, or because the group appears comfortable with them? They begin noticing when agreement happens quickly. They notice when certain perspectives receive encouragement and when other perspectives quietly disappear from the conversation. This awareness alone can be surprisingly powerful, because once someone sees the difference between social alignment and independent thinking, they no longer mistake consensus for truth. They remain curious, they remain observant, and sometimes they ask small questions that gently reopen the space for inquiry. Not confrontational questions, just clarifying ones. What evidence supports that assumption? How would we test that idea? Are there any alternatives that we haven't considered? Questions like these don't attack the group. They simply slow the conversation down long enough for thinking to reappear. And even if the group continues moving in the same direction, the observer maintains something extremely important: their own clarity. They are no longer adjusting their thoughts automatically to match the room. They are watching the room, understanding the signals, seeing how confidence, approval, and belonging influence the flow of ideas. Over time, this perspective creates a kind of quiet independence. The observer can still participate in the group, they can collaborate, they can contribute, but they no longer assume that agreement equals accuracy. They remain aware that groups, like individuals, can drift toward conclusions that feel socially stable rather than intellectually sound. Recognizing this dynamic is one of the ideas I explore further in my book, Psychological Exit Ramps, where I look at the subtle psychological forces that shape how people think inside groups, and the quiet moments when someone begins stepping outside of those forces. Because once you understand how these dynamics work, something interesting happens. You stop trying to control the group. You simply stop letting the group control your thinking. One of the most fascinating things about groupthink is how ordinary it looks from the inside. No one feels manipulated. No one feels coerced. Everyone simply responds to the same signals of approval and belonging. And slowly the group moves together. But occasionally someone notices something that changes the experience entirely. They notice that Agreement can sometimes reflect comfort rather than understanding, and they notice that silence doesn't always mean certainty, and they realize that independent thinking doesn't require dramatic resistance. Sometimes it simply requires the willingness to keep asking quiet questions, even when the room prefers quick answers. That moment, when someone begins observing the group instead of unconsciously merging with it, is the beginning of another exit ramp. And if this idea resonates with you, the next episode explores another psychological exit ramp people discover when they start seeing clearly. Sometimes the most powerful step forward is simply stepping off the road.